Hi, everyone. It's Janice from the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm excited to tell you that my book is now for sale. It's called Divorcing Religion, a memoir and survival handbook. And I'll make sure you have a link in the notes for that. And also, I want to encourage you to like, subscribe, and become a member of my YouTube channel. Take care. Welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious trauma recovery coach. And I'm so pleased to have my guest joining me today, a Native woman of Cherokee and Irish descent, Tessi Ynada Muskrat. Tessi holds a master's degree in counseling psychology and is a doctoral student researcher at the University of Missouri. Co-founder of the International Purity Culture Research Collective, PCRC, Tessi's research centers the voices of those who have experienced sexual and gender-based trauma in religious contexts. Additionally, Tessi works as a post-traumatic growth coach. Oh, I love that. Companioning those who have experienced religious or purity culture trauma on their journey to health and thriving. Tessi's upcoming projects will examine the impact of purity culture's gender binary on trans and non-binary persons and the ways in which post-purity culture adults achieve empowerment through healing from oppressive systems in religious spaces. I'm excited to say that Tessi's also one of the speakers at the upcoming Shameless Sexuality, Life After Purity Culture online conference, where she will talk to us about voices from the bedroom. Purity culture survivors talk about finding healing. I can't wait. Welcome, Tessi.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm really pleased that you're able to join us for the conference because your research just sounds so interesting and so needed today. And I want to hear all about what brought you to this field. Were you a purity culture survivor yourself? Did you grow up in a religious home?
Yeah, absolutely. I did. I have a bit of a different journey than some people because when in my very early years, my parents were 70s hippies that met on a commune, and so like I had some very early like no body shame, everybody's just being really accepting of one another experiences. And then when I was about I was 4, my babysitter evangelized me with flannel graph and told me the story about how I was a sinner and all of that, right? And I remember saying for several nights in a row, prayer of salvation to be sure, that I was going to be good and not end up in hell. And then I started evangelizing my parents, and ultimately they had some other influences going on too. But they converted when I was about 5 or 6. And so my family, like at that point, kind of made a shift that just kept spiraling into more and more fundamentalist experiences of Christianity. So I'm the oldest of 5 siblings, and we all were home educated, which was in many ways really good for me. I'm a very motivated learner, and I was able to take charge of what I wanted to learn and educate myself really well. And at the same time, right, there was a lot of that like very conservative Christian homeschool influence going on. So I was actually like one of the very first people that read Joshua Harris's early works in his New Attitude magazine, which was designed for homeschool teens. And
wow, yeah.
Met him when I was 15. I have the autographed I Kiss Dating Goodbye book, So yeah, when I was 16, I founded a youth ministry that traveled around Missouri, where I grew up, doing what we called chastity events, because that's better than purity events and it's better than abstinence events, right? And
wow.
Trying to influence our using drama and music and all of these things to try to share that message that we now know as purity culture. So did it for a long time. Yeah, long time.
You really bought into it. Like you were wholeheartedly, that became your worldview. And then, of course, nothing's more important than salvation. And next to that, probably nothing is more important than being sexually pure. Wow. You did so much. I mean, as a 15-year-old person, organizing, participating in such events. Wow. So at some point, things shifted for you. So if you
Yeah.
feel comfortable, tell us a little bit
Sure.
about that part of your journey.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. They did. I, uh, I, it took a while to kind of get to the point of understanding the piece that purity culture played in my life. I think I also ran a deaf ministry, youth ministry for a long time. And it was with those kids, it was working with those kids that I really started seeing the being expected to share messages with those kids that were really harmful to them. Right. And I started really seeing how it was harmful to tell these little, queer middle school girls that, yeah, I mean, actually the Bible does say you're going to hell because you're an abomination, right? Like that's hard to say to someone that you care about a lot. And so we really started that religious deconstruction through that process of participating in what I came to realize was really harmful, and then just really searching for how do I make sense of this? And there just wasn't a way to make sense of it, right? There just wasn't, and so ultimately just kind of started letting it go a little at a time. And then was around for long enough that I started really seeing, all of my peers we were all sold out to some degree or another in purity culture. And nobody got what they were promised. Like
Mm,
none of us, I had
mm,
one peer that got married really young and it was like the perfect thing, and then her husband got tragically killed 2 years into their marriage, so it was just, then
sure.
she's a widow at, 22 or whatever. And just like, none of this was what God had promised us that we were going to get. Right. And I was single in my 30s, and never had that husband delivered to me, so just really started seeing, the harmful, not only was it not working for people and we weren't getting the positive side of it, but it also was ending up really being negative as far as, I had friends who found that they couldn't engage in relationships, couldn't engage sexually on their wedding night when they were supposed to be able to just turn that switch on, realizing much later in life than they should have been able to, that they were queer, or they were transgender, or they were non-binary, or that, all of these things that by the time we're in our late 20s and our 30s and even now into our 40s, seeing that these things just really was really harmful to many, many people. And
Oh,
so I just
wow.
kind of started wondering, what can we learn about this, and why it does harm and how it does harm. And then ultimately, because I'm in the counseling psychology field, right? So my primary question is like, how do we help people who have had these experiences that have been really harmful?
Right. Wow. I'm a counselor also, and I have people even in their 70s come to me who had been saving themselves, got my air quotes going, saving themselves for a godly partner who never showed up for whatever reason. And now the people are no longer believers. They've been on a journey of deconstruction or deconversion, and they don't even have a clue how to interact in a way that something that might even lead to dating. And I mean, dating apps are terrifying and horrifying for a lot of people, but especially it can be challenging for those of us who are coming out of a purity culture background, because it's almost like there's no middle ground. It's either people are sending you unsolicited photos of their stuff, which you're not really interested in, or you're not even thinking about it. So yes, I love that you're doing this work and trying to figure out how can we help people, because not everybody's experience is the same, and also boys and men are really, they can be negatively impacted by purity culture teaching as well. So I feel like there's a lot of work to be done in this field.
Yeah, for sure. And in fact, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because the project that I'm working on this summer, that I'm hoping to finish up by fall and start submitting for publication, is actually looking at the group of interviews that I have with people who were assigned male at birth and were socialized in purity culture for some portion or most of their young adult and early adult lives. And I I'm looking forward to looking back at those interviews, because I haven't really been able to since I performed them, and I remember there being such a marked difference for many of those people, in that, because they were assigned male, they were socialized in a really specific way that was very different from all of my assigned female, most of my assigned female interviews, and so I'm really looking forward to doing some work with, what are the themes that we find for those people who were assigned male, who were socialized as men, who were taught to hate their sex drives, and not so much their bodies. So I'm just really looking forward to digging into that for sure, because it is an area
taught
that
to fear women.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And it is just an area that I think that there isn't as much, written about or studied. And so I'm really looking forward to that.
How would you even find people to participate in the research and share their stories with you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I I started my research in undergrad, because I didn't actually go to college until 2018 when I was 38. I started college the fall of what would have been 20 years after I finished high school, because, I was a woman, and so I wasn't supposed to do the school thing. And then I got busy, and then, I always had that, well, maybe, you can go later if you need to. And at some point I was like, okay, I have a career and I'm doing this other thing, but like, I need to go to school for me, and so I was a little bit ahead in some ways. And so I started doing this research as an undergraduate project, actually. And when I first released my call for participants, I had hundreds of participants within 48 hours, which is just unheard of. I mean, it's just, I put it out on my social media. My friends put it out on their social media. I dropped it in purity culture recovery groups, homeschool alumni groups, just lots of places. And I ended up with over 1,300 survey respondents for my study, and over 500 people offering to be interviewed, which, it's just not possible to do that many interviews. Wow. And so so far on that project, I've performed almost 60 interviews, and I'm still just kind of working my way through it. Very excited because my article on looking at the purity culture impact for queer women and non-binary people assigned female at birth has just been accepted to a psychology journal, and it'll be out in July. I've been working on that one for 5 years, so I'm really excited to see it hitting a pretty well-known journal that will be able to reach mental health professionals. I'm really excited about it.
That's terrific. And I mean, especially right now, so you're in the United States, and when we look at the implementation, unfortunately, of Project 2025, and how that is very likely to, and already is negatively impacting, reproductive sovereignty. And I think students will be lacking in accurate sex education. Probably, teachers won't even be allowed to talk about it in some places. And it's a matter of life or death. I feel people must be able to learn about their body and other people's bodies, what happens when these bodies get together in a sexual way. And then, of course, that whole piece of pleasure, which is our birthright, sexual pleasure, because we're able to experience it. So, boy, oh boy, I'm trying to wrap my mind around you getting the so many results from your questionnaire of asking people who wanted to participate. That's just phenomenal.
Yeah, it's been really amazing. I've found that so many people have a story that they want to share, and over and over in the process of looking through the survey results and in the interviews, a lot of people were just like, wow, it's so good to be able to talk about this. It's so good to be able to, it's just as I'm sitting and I'm thinking about answering these questions, like I feel like it's healing something in me. And those were in some cases, those are people that just filled out a survey, and wrote about their experiences in that process. And it's so healing to have your story told, to be seen, to know that there's a validation that comes with that. I as an Indigenous person, I I'm approaching my research from sort of a story-based, autoethnographic, indigenous knowledges perspective, right? And some of the premier authors in that who write about that sort of research talk about how like it's not that we have a story, it's that we are a story. That is all that there is to us, and so to be able to share that with someone is a way of giving yourself to someone. And I just am really aware of that when people participate in research, that they're giving a piece of who they are to me and to everyone else who's able to benefit from it, so that's just really an
That's
honor.
beautiful. That's such a beautiful way to look at it. And when I think of Indigenous groups that I'm aware of in Canada, I feel like they have been far, far ahead of the game when we think in spirits of, or in the idea of recognizing two-spirit people, and going back many, many generations, and just that there wasn't pretending, there was a recognition. Not everybody's the same, and not everybody has to be the same. So I think there's something very beautiful about that, and I don't know. Maybe you can speak to this. Certainly, in the purity culture community, there's a great deal of shame around sex and sexuality. So that's Abrahamic religious culture. What in Indigenous communities that you're aware of, is there the same shame there as in the purity culture communities, or are things just a much more open, this is just your body, this is what happens?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't think that there's a single answer. I think one of the things about Indigenous communities is that there's a lot of diversity. We are many different nations and many different tribes, and we have different histories, So my mother has worked in the Diné Nation with the Navajo people, and their culture is and language and practices are so much more intact than historically the Cherokee have been. And so for my, my personal experience is that, my family converted to Christianity, I think primarily Baptist practices generations ago, right? And so we had practicing Christians who were on the Trail of Tears, right? They were removed, but already still trying to assimilate, trying to practice that religion. And so much of the baggage is the same. When you have generations of Christianity, there's other layers to it because you're also impacting, that culture and that heritage. But certainly the similar sorts of sexual shame when you have similar sorts of religious practice, But there's diversity, like I said, other tribes I can't speak to.
Right. Well, when you started questioning, about talking with these young teenage queer girls, and recognizing it's very uncomfortable for me to tell them that they are an abomination. So then you also started just trying to work things out in your religious beliefs also. What maybe is real, what isn't real, or what is unhealthy, in this mix of things. At what point did you recognize that purity culture had also left a mark on you?
That's really an evolving piece for me personally.
Okay.
I identify on the asexual spectrum, and so my experience of purity culture was, I learned later when I started having these conversations with people, very different from many of my peers, in that I wasn't having these responses and reactions and urges that they were having, and so there were many ways that left me sort of in this unwounded space. Because I didn't have that shame piece, and so when I did eventually enter into a relationship that was sexual in nature, it was just like this beautiful discovery for me, But I am finding even now as I go further and further and deeper into it, right, because this healing thing is such a journey, that I find that it crops up in ways and places that I would never expect it. And so like this year, for example, I've had some situations in my life where I've been trying to make some life decisions, and I was noticing like just this really extreme sense of like, I mean, like I'm panicking, I'm having meltdowns, I'm, like going back to my therapist and like we're 2 minutes into session and I'm just like weeping again. And I'm like, what in the world? Like something is being tapped into and I don't know what it is. And I finally was able to really recognize and name that as like the impact of the surveillance piece of purity culture for me. And then I'm in this place now where I'm like nobody's watching me. And I get to do like adult decisions, and technically maybe it doesn't actually impact anybody. That's wild when you grow up in the church and you're a church leader and you have this tight-knit community where the moment you ride in a car with a boy 20 minutes to their house, your dad knows about it by the time you get home, right? Not even exaggeration. And so here I am, like, this adult professional, and I'm realizing that I'm panicking because I'm afraid that people are going to know what decision I made about a relationship. Because surely somebody's is watching, and not only will people know, but like it'll be my fault if it harms them. And like that's just such an irrational and heavy way to be living, right?
Yeah.
And that directly comes from my experience of purity culture, which was so much about performance and caring for other people and protecting other people through my own actions, and like never making decisions that were my decisions that were right for me, but only always through that lens of other people. And so like now I'm trying to practice that decision making of like, what do I want? What will make me happy? What will open me up in that, blooming, beautiful way that I want to be? And then I hit a wall of like, oh, I'm just terrified that like, I don't believe in hell anymore, but there's still this sense that like, this very heavy sense of my choices could potentially really harm someone else. And so like, that's one of those things that I'm working through, for myself now. Who knows what it'll be in 6 months, right? Like it just comes up and you're like, oh, wow, this is purity culture again. Wow. Okay. Yeah. It looks different for everybody. Yeah.
Right. So how long have you been studying purity culture, or even kind of giving it that name?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I started my research project in 2020. So I was doing Zoom interviews in the middle of COVID. And but the interest peaked before that. I actually was attending a sort of a progressive Christian conference festival in the late like teens, 20 teens, and that's where I really first started hearing this conversation. Right, like I was having my own experiences over here, but there's always that like, oh no, this is just like my friends or something, And then I started really tapping into that broader conversation around religious trauma and around purity culture. And then the Me Too movement and the Church Too movement, right, really hit. And I got to see Emily Joy Allison speak on the Church Too movement and started just really being like, oh, this is a lot bigger than me and my friends. And so then I was like, how, started noticing how little knowledge there was in the therapy world. That's grown a lot since then, but there's still stories available all of the time. All of the time, I see stories about people who are seeking healing for their purity culture wounds, and they're invalidated by their therapists. They're told that they just, need to stop. Let's say you need to stop using porn because that's not good for anybody, and it's like having these messages that are re-wounding people from licensed mental health workers who don't understand. Either they're minimizing because they haven't had the experience, or they're, they have their own baggage that they haven't worked with. And so we really just started wanting to do work that would be accessible to mental health workers and also to people who have experiences with purity culture, so that we can kind of try to support people on both sides. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And I want to give a huge shout out to my friend, colleague, mentor, Dr. Daryl Ray. And Daryl founded Recovering from Religion. And one of his incredible books is called Sex and God. And I feel like that is such an important book for people to read. And here I am now in my 50s, and I'd say I've been out of religion maybe for about 15 years now, around that time. And last year I published my memoir, Divorcing Religion, a Memoir and Survival Handbook. And as I was doing research and preparing to write it, that's when I really started finding out about something called yes, no, maybe lists. And you probably are already familiar with it. So in the context of sex and sexuality, it's the idea of, what do I feel comfortable with? What am I curious about? What would I be willing to try? Maybe on my own, could be solo, could be with my partner. What's a hard no for me? And just the idea of giving ourselves permission to be curious and then to have the experience of giving consent or withholding consent. Because growing up in the Christian world, especially if we were fundamentalists, consent is not something that was really discussed. And especially those of us assigned female at birth, the expectation was no sex until marriage, and then you do what your husband wants.
Yeah.
And then it
And you
doesn't matter
better
if you're
not.
tired.
Yeah. Yep. And you better not have experimented in advance, because then you might be disappointed with what your husband has to offer.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
So that can be
absolutely.
so jarring and shocking when people realize, wow, you mean I actually do have a choice. I can say yes or no. And for me, it was even a revelation when when it clicked for me that maybe I did not have to stay in my marriage, in my first marriage, because that divorce had never been an option that I would consider. And then when someone I loved and deeply respected, my own mother, when she told me that she was separating from my dad, it's like the door opened just a tiny little bit and a little bit of light came in and made me think, oh, wow, if someone as wonderful as my mom is allowed to have her own voice finally and make this decision for herself, maybe I can do something similar. And so that was really part of my journey, and the whole thing about self-discovery and sex. What do I like? What am I open to? It was a big deal, a big part of my own healing, and it certainly wasn't graceful. It's pretty messy. So I recommend people work with a therapist or a
Yeah, it
counselor.
can be very helpful. For sure, for sure. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I've had the opportunity to work with some clients on lists like that. And it's been especially interesting working with clients who are gender non-binary or transgender, right? And who are trying to kind of like step into their sexuality, and looking at those yes, no, maybe lists have a lot more categories in them. There's a lot more nuance to what you may or may not be open to, what might feel comfortable, what might not feel comfortable, what might feel affirming to your own gender and your body, and what doesn't. And it's just a whole journey, and it can definitely be helpful to have somebody there along the way with you.
Hi, everyone. It's Janice from the Divorcing Religion podcast. I want to let you know that the Shameless Sexuality Life After Purity Culture Conference has now been changed to an online event. Tickets are much cheaper, and it is safer for everyone involved. Please join us. Go to shamelesssexuality.org today to get your ticket. One of the questions that came up for me when I was looking through these different lists was the idea of, am I comfortable with my sexual partner sharing the details of our time together with other people? Like if I'm not there and they're in a group of people, do I feel comfortable with them? And that was something, again, that I hadn't even thought about. But I want people to get used to and start thinking in those terms of what they consent to and what they don't consent to. Just because we need practice. We need practice being able to say no when we want to say no. And sometimes our body is telling us, giving us signals and hints that we're not really comfortable with something. And again, when we're raised in Christianity, especially I am thinking as people assigned female at birth, we are taught to override that. Our primary way of being is to serve. That's what we're told. That's what we must do. We are to serve others. And of course, codependency can spring out of that as well. So just getting to know ourselves and what we're comfortable with.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very important. And I think one of the delightful pieces to me is that not only do we get to learn how to say no, we also get to learn to say yes. And some of us get more opportunity than others, kind of depending on our relationship structures and what's going on with that. But
Yeah.
a lot of people are finding really creative ways of learning to say yes to things that actually are a yes for them, and they didn't maybe ever think that it could be something that they could experiment with, try, enjoy, whatever that looks like. So that's one of the pieces that I think is really, really neat for me as well. So it's both sides of that, right? And we have to have both in place. If we get to say no, we also get to say yes. And sometimes some of the really difficult things can be for people who are assigned female at birth and end up in a heterosexual relationship where there's a sexual mismatch, and they're the ones who have more desire or more interest or more ready to go, and there can be so much baggage around that, a lot of shame around that, because we're not thought that can be a possibility, and so it's just a lot of nuance. I think it's really exciting to be able to explore, but it can definitely be overwhelming if you're just kind of like jumping in without a support system, so
yeah. And even the idea that people have sex for many, many different reasons, and sometimes we might not even be really conscious and aware of what is driving us. If we're struggling with low self-esteem, it might be a way that we're feeling affirmed and desired if we're having sex, or maybe there's been attachment issues in childhood, and so that's something that we're working out. And if we're not aware of it, we're not able to talk with our partner about it. So sex can get complicated and messy, and it can be wonderful and healing as well. So I'm really glad that we're having the conference, the Shameless Sexuality Conference, because I want it to be de-shamified. And I wonder about the shame piece. If you would talk a little bit about that. Is that something, either in your research or when you're working with clients, is shame something that comes up for them around sex?
Oh yeah, all of the time, and it's such a tricky thing because, right, we can feel shame because we don't want to have as much sex as our husband wants, and we've been told that we should. We can feel shame because we want to have more sex. I mean, like it doesn't doesn't matter where we fall on the spectrum or what it is that we are or not interested in. We can figure out a way to feel shame about it because there's just so much shaming in the messages, right, of those high control religions around sexuality, around gender expression, around sexual engagement, around monogamy and non-monogamy. And I mean, there's just, I don't know if I have had a single interview where it wasn't something that came up as a pretty prominent thing. So it's definitely one of the biggest pieces that we have to work with ourselves and when I'm working with clients, for sure.
Something that it has just been interesting to me through the years is how I could feel so like happy and almost relieved watching shows like RuPaul's Drag Race, or shows where there are drag queens, and just seeing. And I think what it is for me is people embodying, like having so much confidence and so much sass and just being themselves. I'm going to get out there. I'm going to do, this is my world. And you're not going to tell me what I can and cannot be and what I can and cannot do. Because growing up as a person assigned female in a fundamentalist Christian home, it was very much, I was told what I could and couldn't do, and how I could and couldn't behave, how I could dress, these sorts of things, what TV I could watch. So to me, there's such freedom around people who are just being flamboyantly and outrageously themselves.
Yeah,
And I feel like that's some people that must be deeply empowering. And of course, also being on stage, we get to embody things that maybe are different than who we've been able to be in real life. So that's something else that I encourage some of my clients to do, is to look at hobbies in the realm of theater that can just help them experience different things. And we can try different identities on and see what fits for us. And we don't have to be judgmental about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've definitely got a future second career as a burlesque dancer that's going to happen someday. It's like on my bucket list, right?
I love it.
There's not time for that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And those things show up in the sometimes in the most unexpected ways. I was like 3 years into my education, and I've been working with this research mentor who was working to get me into grad school, and he, at some point, he turned to me and he said, you are the most ambitious student that I've ever had. And I just froze and shut down and felt like I should apologize. And I was just like, I managed to not thank you and walk away and make an appointment with the therapist, right? Because, that was just not an okay word to be used to describe me, even at 3 years into my education, in pushing 40 and all of those, and I working so eagerly and consistently toward my research and all of that, but it was just like, but no, like, men are ambitious, women should not be ambitious.
Wow.
And I was just like, yeah, and it was just like right there, and it's one of those, you just hit that wall and you're like, oh well, that's interesting. Guess I'm going to sit with that. Yeah.
How do you feel about it now? The idea of being told and recognized for being someone who has ambitions.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm working on being good with it. No, I think one of the things that I'm really been sitting with is that I very much identify as a woman, and I have had to do a lot of work to put aside those descriptors and understandings of what that is supposed to mean, right? And so, like, I am a woman and I can be ambitious. Like, putting that dialectic together has been really interesting for me. I am a woman and I would rather not bake cookies for a granddaughter, right? Like, that's, yeah, it's still a journey. It's still a journey. And I still don't know that I define myself that way. And also I think it's true, and so I still sit with that sort of thing for sure. Yeah.
I wonder how different it would be if we grew up in circumstances where we really were in a matriarchy. And I know some Indigenous groups, they are matriarchal. How different would that be if the people that we looked to were women, if the people who were making decisions were women? I feel like that, I just almost can't even imagine that, because that is so opposite to how the rest of our society and in Canada and the United States seems to function. But I would be very interested in finding out about that, and even just somehow spending a weekend, a week, a month in circumstances like that. And here's the one thing I did that just gave me a little taste, maybe, when I started my Twitter, which I'm not on Twitter anymore. When I did start on Twitter, I made 2 accounts, and one was me and my face and communicating the way that I communicate. And the other, I didn't put my picture, and I just put on there divorcing religion. And I thought, I'm going to talk like a man, how I think a man would communicate with this account that I have. And I'm not going to put emojis, and I'm not going to be flowery. I'm going to say what I think and what I mean. And sure enough, the feedback that I would get from people, they'd call, right on, man, and way to go, brother, and those types of things. And it was super interesting because I felt this is what it feels like to be able to glide through, move through society, believing that I'm allowed to say what I think instead of having to couch everything flowery and apologetically. And it felt pretty good, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I may or may not have a second secret private account on Blue Sky. Some of my friends know it's me, but not everybody, So yeah, I mean, sometimes we need those spaces to really kind of explore and try on different things, And I sit with things like, I feel fine with the idea of being driven. That's totally fine with me. Ambitious, not so much. And so, like, what is the difference for me? And what I don't consider myself ambitious, and it has nothing to do with gender. I don't know, But like, really setting with things like that can be really interesting. And yeah, like practicing using your voice. That was one of the main reasons that I started started a college career at the age of 38. Was that I realized I had things to say, but I wasn't sure what they were going to be. And I needed to be in a position to say them, to use my own voice to say them. And yeah, that's been a whole adventure. I'm kind of digging it.
Yeah, for sure. It's so interesting. And I went back to school in my 40s. So I divorced my husband, divorced my religion, and decided I was going to go back to school because I love working with people. I love hearing people's stories. And then just really kind of fell into the whole niche of religious trauma and purity culture recovery. So you mentioned earlier on that you identify or had identified with asexuality. And was that a relief when you came across that word? Was that like, oh, that explains things? Are you still that way? Are you growing and changing? Please tell me more, because I don't know much about asexuality.
Sure. Yeah, well, it can be a big spectrum. So I identify as gray sexual, which means that I have very limited sexual attraction. There's been like maybe 3 people in my life that I've just like automatically had that experience of like, oh my God, my whole body is responding to that person.
Wow.
But I'm very sex positive, and at a lot of periods in my life, I've had a pretty high libido, and so I find myself able to engage in sex sometimes in a way that is more maybe stereotypically male than, as how a man was rather than female. So that's been really interesting. Enjoying, sex that's really relationships that are really focused on like we get together and we do this activity and then you go home and I get to do what I want to do, and and not necessarily needing that the same level of connection that like my demisexual friends do, which is also like on that spectrum of asexuality, right? So a lot of things clicked for me. I'll never forget having this. It was actually, we were at my mom's wedding, because she also left a very abusive and controlling religious relationship, and she ended up getting remarried a few years ago. And I was having this conversation with my sibling on that weekend, right, where I was like, okay, wait a minute, we need to go back to like 14. When you said this, what were you experiencing? And they like described it to me, and I was like, oh. And they were like, that's not like, we were using the same language. Like I was talking about like, oh, I really like that guy, and this or that, or oh, she's so beautiful, whatever. Like we're using the same language and we're having completely different body experiences. And we're in our 30s figuring this out. Right. So it really did make a whole lot of things make sense to me. Especially as far as like my experience with purity culture and why it was that I came out of it like without as much shame around sexuality as many people did, because I just didn't struggle, right? Like it wasn't, I didn't have that early sexual awakening experience that many people do, where they start discovering their bodies, until I was in, well into my 20s, which is pretty unusual. Also, I wonder how it would have been without purity culture, right, as well, because, I did work very hard to not be exposed to, I was the shut your eyes in the movie theater, have my friends preview movies for me so I could get up and leave at the theater and come back after the scene was over. Like, I really worked to keep exposure to media out of my life. But so did my sibling. We were in the same household, in the same family, and they were having very different experiences. And so that was really what made me go, okay, no, like this is not an allosexual experience, right, that I've been having. And so it's an ongoing discovery for me. I'm still figuring out what it means and still learning, things, but I'm really enjoying the process.
Yeah. And
that is learning to say no when I'm like, yes, I've been with this person however many times and they would like to come over again. And I'm just not, haven't been in for months. That's okay too, So.
Yes. So you had a significant conversation with one of your siblings. Do your siblings and your mom know that this is part of your work as around purity culture recovery? Have some of them retained, their firm religious beliefs and maybe have a total disagreement with what you're doing? How does that factor in at all?
No, that's a great question. With large sibling groups, it's pretty complicated. None of us have stayed in that fundamentalist Christianity. Some of us have tended to kind of jump into a different form of fundamentalism that could be similarly harmful. So that could get really complicated. My mom has been on this amazing healing journey where she tries to meet all of her kids where they are and understand.
Wow.
I have some transgender nibblings, and one of my siblings is in a poly relationship, and every time one of us is like, "Oh, Mom, so," she's like, "Okay, give me a book." About it, and so she's going to figure it out, because she just really, really cares about us. And she's still, I think, maybe more religious than the rest of us are, but like she's figuring out how to work that into her life in a way that is not harmful, but is actually really helpful for her. So, I'm there for that. I'm there for the positive side of spirituality. That happens for a few people too. My dad, on the other hand, wrote me a very stern, rebuking letter when I graduated with my bachelor's degree about how I was, joining the feminazi brigade of something, and so no, we haven't spoken in a while. So
wow.
There's just everybody in my family's been on their own journey, but we all kind of know where each other is, and that informs our relationship sometimes. So
yeah. Well, would you talk a little bit about post-traumatic growth coaching that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So once upon a time, before I went to school, I trained as a spiritual director. And it was really interesting when I started practicing spiritual direction. I was still in the church tenuously at that time. And the clients that I started drawing, inevitably, we'd be 5 or 6 or 10 or 12 sessions in, and like, actually, they're queer and they're trying to figure out how to be queer and also be a Christian. And by the time we're done seeing each other, the Christian part is not happening anymore. And I'm like, I'm failing as a spiritual director, right? So I'm joking because I'm really not, right? They're on their own beautiful journey of discovering what it means to be a spiritual, soulful person and also fully embodying who you are, And so at this point, I'm not licensed as a counselor yet. I'm not licensed as a psychologist yet. I will be in a few years. But I see a spattering of clients who are really just kind of trying to work with all of these pieces of like, I had this experience, I have this trauma around my gender, around my sexuality, around relationships, and with this religious component. And I just really want to be healthy, right? I really want to grow. And so we look at a lot of like where, what is life-giving in your life? What is producing growth and health and beauty? What makes you come alive? Where are those resiliency pieces that really inform how we can grow through our healing process? And it's always really an honor when I get to companion someone through that process. Yeah.
Nice. Oh, yeah. I really appreciate that. It seems like a lot of times people can, in their deconstruction or deconversion journeys, can get really hung up on the anger piece, which anger makes sense. We feel angry for a lot of very valid reasons, but it doesn't help us to stay stuck there. So I like the idea of also reconstructing, rebuilding your life. What do you want? What feels good for you? What are you curious about? And again, there's that piece of giving ourselves permission to even think, maybe think bigger than we've ever been allowed to think before. I mean, I know a big deal for me was giving myself permission to read anything. Nothing was going to be off limits for me again, just because it was supposed to be off limits. Like, give myself permission to explore, investigate, go to concerts, go to festivals, go to the art museum. There's so many different things to experience in this life. This is it. This is me in my body. What do I want to experience? And I just think that's such a joyful way of being after so many years of really being oppressed.
Yeah, absolutely. Once we start, one of the pieces of that deconstruction piece, right, is that it's almost like you are taking down these walls that have kept you in this space, and then it's like, okay, well, then that means I get to expand. But like, that's big and scary if you haven't done it before, and if you don't know where you want to go or what you want it to look like, it's really exciting, and it's also really terrifying. And so, yeah, being able to move out past that, rather than just staying angry that there were walls. I think that's a good way to think about it. Yeah. And sometimes there's a lot of working with grief too. That's part of that, right? Like, sometimes I think we jump straight to anger because it's harder to really sit with grief about what we've lost through these experiences that we've had, the ways we've been limited. And so I definitely do quite a bit of also sitting with people in grief, and sometimes that's things you didn't learn, things you didn't experience, things you think it's too late for you to experience. Sometimes I just challenge that. But, and sometimes it's grief of things that were good that have been lost, because there weren't tenable for us, there wasn't enough good. But that doesn't mean that we don't miss some of those relationships sometimes and things like that, so yeah, a lot of grief sometimes, but then we always couple that with the and you have now all of these directions to grow and to learn and to figure yourself out. And how do you want to do that?
Wow. Oh, I think from what you've described to me, that clients who work with you will be exposed to hope and receive hope, pardon me, from you. And I can't imagine a lovelier thing for us to be able to share with our clients. It's been so nice meeting you and talking with you. I can't wait to hear and learn from you at the conference.
I'm really excited. Thank you so much.
Tessi, is there a way that people could find you?
Yeah. So my research page is puritycultureoutcomes.com. So I try to keep my publications and my presentations pretty current, posted there, so that those people who've shared story with me will be able to access it or to share it with other people. I also can find me on Blue Sky at Muskrat Tessi, Facebook at The Barefoot Journey. Smattering of social media and web pages and all of that. So also I'm the only Tessi Muskrat out there. So really just Google and you will find me.
Excellent. That's fantastic. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for joining me and having this conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Be sure to make your way to shamelesssexuality.org so you can pick up your tickets for this event we're talking about. It's going to be an online event happening May 24th and 25th, 2025. And if you have anything to share with me, you can reach me at divorcingreligion.com. So thanks again and take care, everyone.